Well, I think it's a fairly loaded question that impacts different countries within the region differently. As we consider, let's say, Central Asia versus the Caucasus, they are in different ways reliant on the ultimate outcome in Ukraine. For example, if we're looking at the broader Caucasus region, certainly Georgia is very much reliant on a Ukrainian victory. And I'll preface this all by saying that when we talk about Ukrainian victory, we're talking about the removal of all Russian troops from Ukrainian soil, going back to the borders of 1991. And so when we think about that victory and what that means, Georgia, for example, it puts them in a strong position, I'd say a more advantageous position to, I think, be a little bit bolder in the region, and particularly insofar as their Euro-Atlantic aspirations are concerned. There are concerns as well that a Russian loss could ultimately result in some type of a propaganda attack, if you will, on Georgia for its own population, some sort of a quick victory. But again, this is all the more reason why it's imperative that Georgia stand with its Western partners as we talk about the war in Ukraine. With Armenia, it's a bit of a different situation, particularly now that we've seen Azerbaijan sort of fully take back Nagorno-Karabakh, if you will, and of course the forced expulsion of over 100,000 now ethnic Armenians from the region. On the one hand, this is of course quite, I think, devastating for Armenia as a nation. On the other hand, what this probably tells to them is that we no longer are getting the security guarantees that we've been promised by Russia. The Collective Security, CSTO, Collective Security Treaty Organization, no longer protects us in the way we need. Neither does the Eurasian Economic Union. So I think there may be more of a desire, a genuine desire from Armenia to move towards the Euro-Atlantic community. When we look at Azerbaijan, I think it's a bit more of a different situation. The government there is what it is. I think we all kind of acknowledge that. But having said that, we rely on them, both economically in terms of certain forms of trade and energy diversification, as well as security guarantees insofar as their relationship with Turkey, which is a NATO member, is concerned. So I think in these ways, what happens in Ukraine could impact the entire region either positively or negatively. Central Asia is a bit of a different story. Of course, we've already seen circumstances now where certain countries within Central Asia are a little bit more bold in terms of acknowledging that they don't as much need Russia anymore. They're not as reliant on them, and they don't have as much faith or trust in that Russia is going to provide them with the security guarantees they've provided over the last 20 years. And so a loss in Ukraine, it could cause Russia to try and shore up its interests in Central Asia. It could also prompt Central Asian countries, particularly Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, to be a little bit more bold. So I think in those ways, a lot is really relying on what happens in Ukraine. And that's not, of course, a great prospect, but if I'm now the West and I'm looking at this situation, if I'm the US, if I am broader Europe, of course, the NATO community, all of my interests should be on a Ukrainian victory. So it's a good question. And I'd say the answer to that question all depends on the desired direction of each of the governments within both the Caucasus, broader Caucasus region, and Central Asia. So do they want to be a democracy? Do they want to be a kleptocracy, an authoritarian regime, if you will? Certainly those, corruption has been an issue most prominently in Central Asia, but also across certain parts of the Caucasus as well, and to varying degrees. And I think that always opens itself up or creates a vulnerability which authoritarian regimes like Russia or even China can exploit and utilize to their advantage. I was having this discussion with members of my team recently, and it's an often conversation about the threat that is Russia, and we live and we work in Georgia. And they were advocating that no, Russia is the main problem, and I said no, Russia's not the main problem. Russia's always going to be a problem. Russia's always there. It's like the sky. you can't get rid of it, right? You have to adapt to whatever the weather patterns will be with the sky, but ultimately it's not going anywhere. Russia's not leaving, right? Russia is a nation, it is a neighbor, whether Georgia likes it or not. So the problem isn't Russia any more than Russia is already a problem and will always be likely a security problem and threat for Georgia. The problem is corrupt people either within Georgia or other countries, for example, who are more susceptible to, let's say, corrupt practices or kleptocratic regimes. And when they are open to that, they weaken or make the country more vulnerable. And the same principle or concept is true all across the Caucasus and of course, Central Asia. So if they want to be a democracy, at least in the Caucasus, that opportunity exists. It does certainly for Georgia by standing with, of course, its Western and European partners. And I think that door is also opening for Armenia. Azerbaijan, again, is in a different situation, and I think we all sort of acknowledge that, but also acknowledge the need of maintaining certain degrees of partnership, and I'll be happy to get more into that later. With Central Asia, it's a bit of a different situation. They have been marred for 30 plus years since the collapse of the Soviet Union with issues of either single party or single leader, strongman rule, as well as governments that are sort of operating more closely to certain sort of the Russian pay-to-play kleptocratic practices. And I'd say in those circumstances, it opens them up quite a bit more to vulnerabilities that make them susceptible to Chinese influence and as well as Russian influence. So in those ways, Russia and China's interests compete. I would say that China has taken a much longer term approach than the Russians. And this is where the Belt and Road Initiative has had such an impact, not just across the region in Central Asia, but now is attempting to do so throughout the Middle Corridor and as well as in the Caucasus. This would be a much more, I think, general response if I wasn't somebody who happened to know both regions very well and have worked for, now almost 15 years in the two regions. So I'll go through them kind of one by one. For Georgia, very simple. Acceding towards the Euro-Atlantic, towards the European Union, as well as towards NATO, with official candidacy and then membership in both of those communities as a fully embraced member of Europe. Armenia, I would love to see the same for them, and kind of underscoring some of those points that I mentioned earlier, following Nagorno-Karabakh, following the notion of a contested region, and following Armenia's now realization, or soon-to-be realization, that Russia won't provide the security guarantees that it needs. I think that door is opening more and more for Armenia to move a little bit closer towards Europe. They still face the challenge of relations with Turkey and with Azerbaijan, and of course that relationship puts them in a difficult position. Armenia has a tough neighborhood in that way, but I do think that there is a real desire, as we've seen in our programming has seen in Armenia, for them to move towards the Euro-Atlantic structures and institutions. For Azerbaijan, I don't see them moving towards Europe particularly, at least not under the Aliyev regime. But because of the war in Ukraine, there's been an increased need for having Azerbaijan both as a trade partner as well as sort of a security guarantee in the region. They're a close relationship with Turkey, which, as I noted earlier, is a NATO member, as well as when we consider energy diversification, when we talk about natural gas and other issues that we don't want to be taking from Russia anymore, Azerbaijan poses a bit of an alternative that's quite valuable. So even if they're not going to move towards the Euro-Atlantic structures, having that relationship in place, I think, is still a significant value for the West and a strong alliance in any case. Looking towards Central Asia, if we think about Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, there's high potential for them to be much more autonomous than they used to be. One, there have just been consistent changes in the regimes that have shifted over the last 10 years, following Uzbekistan's change after the Karimov regime sort of was no longer in control. The same goes with Nazarbayev, in Kazakhstan, forgive me. Keep going back some leaders now. But we're seeing shifts there, and those combined with two key factors. One, One is that both nations have always been a little bit more defiant towards Russia when they wanted to be. There were times when they stepped out on their own and said, no, we're not going to follow whatever it is Russia's dictating, right? So there's already that sense there. The second deals in the fact that they're large nations that have resources and can be a bit more self-reliant and self-sufficient. And so I think in those ways, combined with the fact that they're also realizing that those security guarantees that came from the CSTO, that came from the Eurasian Economic Union, are no longer what they were promised to be, or no longer mean as much as they did following the invasion of Ukraine. I think there's a greater desire for both countries to be sort of more free of Russia's grip, if you will. Now, having said that, and before I go further, I'll say also then with Kyrgyzstan, a much more difficult situation. I lived many years there. I worked many years there. It's a wonderful country, but it's a smaller country. They don't have the resources available that Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan have. They've had difficulties in terms of nationalization issues when you look at gold, which is one of their main resources that they're able to monetize. And so because of that, they have to balance, I think, a little bit more. They have a little bit more difficulty being free from that grip, if you will. They also don't share a border with Russia, so that, I think, works out to their advantage. But then we think about the challenges for these three countries specifically, and I'm not including, I'm not speaking directly about Turkmenistan or Tajikistan. Corruption. First, historically, this has been an issue in all three nations to varying degrees. And that gets back into that issue of resilience. The more there are people who are open to it, the easier it is for nations like Russia or China to sort of seep their way in and find those cracks and exploit them. The second is poverty. And that is always a problem. So when we talk about the work we do, democracy and governance or economic growth, there's always a bit of a healthy rivalry about which one's more important. And the true answer is that they're both equally important, and they should be working together in a very symbiotic relationship. The more economically stable a nation is and the more prosperous its citizens are, the more they can focus on having what is a stable and functioning democracy, the more resilient they are and the more less susceptible they are to, let's say, corrupt practices. So I think that requires a whole system-wide sense of education. And in those ways, there's an opportunity for the US, for Europe to be investing more heavily in education programs, economic growth programs, as well as democracy and governance programs, and balancing those as effectively and as realistically as they can in those three nations. Because they're going to have to balance China. And China's not going anywhere. Whatever happens in Ukraine will impact Russia and its position in the world as a power. But China is at least for now, is here to stay, even if its economy is not growing at the rate it was, let's say, in the last 20 years. We have to accept the reality that the Central Asian countries aren't going to be a part of the European structures. They are a part of Europe, of Asia. And so I think in those ways, the US and Europe writ large need to be realistic about how far they can go in Central Asia, what degree of influence they can have, how they can help them to realize their aspirations as a nation, but also keeping in mind the fact that China has invested heavily and will continue to do so, and that it is in their interest to do so. Lastly, I'll just touch on Russia, because Russia is, I think, a weakening power, and I would say that that is true across the region here, both in the broader Caucasus region as well as in Central Asia. And most of these countries know it. As I noted before, they're just not able to provide the guarantees that they once were. And so I think as more nations realize that they don't need Russia, that's going to ideally stimulate a greater sense of autonomy and a desire for increased liberty. And you know, we hope ideally in those moments, that's times when we, the partners in the West, can be there to support them and stand by them in those times of need.